Michael was starting to say, people often think they know what activism is. Activism is working for change, which usually means working for redistribution of resources to people who don't have it, from people who do, or it means the expansion of political or legal rights in society where people have been excluded from the political process. It's to save the environment, measured by ending or opposing global warming. In other words, it's a very hard-boiled, hard-working process of creating material changes based on the existing inequalities and injustices in the society. And all that work is incredibly important, and I identify with it, and I do it. My partner, Lisa Jakes, who's in the back of the room, is a union organizer, and I was on her picket line outside the Hilton last night because that Hilton is a boycotted hotel trying to cut back on the health care of the room cleaners and bellmen and waiters and all the folks who actually make that hotel work. So that's one of 10 boycotted hotels right now in San Francisco, and that work is all incredibly important and absolutely critical and valid. The only thing is that historically, all of the struggles for social change that have worked within that framework of a critique of something called the economic system or the social structure have tended to see the reality as if it were an external entity that needed to be fixed, changed, or altered, without focusing enough on, without being attentive to the interior, the internal dimension of how that world is lived, and without speaking to the spiritual needs that people have that aren't captured by those metaphors and that traditional approach to activism. Specifically, what I learned from the whole process of my life, I think I partly learned it from my parents who were actors. My mother, Arlene Francis, those of you who are older in the room may remember my mother, she was on a television show called What's My Line. She was a serious actress, but she was also on a very popular game show, and in fact you can see almost all the episodes of What's My Line now on YouTube. So, and from her, there are many disadvantages to growing up in an actor's family, but I was lucky to have my mother convey that to me, and from her I felt, I got a sense that there is a longing in people for what I call mutual recognition, a longing to see and be seen by the other in a way in which you become present to the other, suddenly feel whole where you felt hesitant, drifty, and withdrawn before, and that process, the seeking of that kind of connected community that is based on what Martin Buber called a relationship of I and thou, where you see the other person in his or her authentic humanity, that is a critical spiritual need in all human beings, that we are all social beings and long for that kind of recognition and connection with one another. And we live in a world in which that longing is everywhere denied around us. It's denied, and we are all part of a network of the denial of this desire. We pass each other with blank gazes on the street. We step over the homeless person, and it's understandable that we would, considering the whole social circumstances. But we don't actually often recognize each other in this vitalizing and connecting and empowering way, in a way that makes us present to each other. When I was in law school, I got my first my ideas about this were kind of developing when every night I saw the newscaster come on, and here's how he spoke. This is in between 69 and 72. His name was Tom Ellis. For those of you that knew Boston newscaster, he would come on and say, "The Red Sox win in fire in Dorchester, back in a moment." You know, like that. And I was pushed back into my couch by that, like, there's no relationship between the Red Sox winning and a fire in Dorchester where people may have been killed or injured. This man is not making any connection between those two things. Actually, he's not there at all. He's putting on a persona, and that persona is in some way covering his outside, and yet, and his gestures are a little behind. And by the way, now that kind of announcer isn't around as much anymore. Now it's been updated to the more casual, the 60s kind of influenced weatherman and newsman. So now it's, oh, wouldn't have expected the rain to stop so early, John. Eh? Then John says, oh, well, John will say whenever he can stammer out in his role, and he can get to the commercial, which is coming next, to then come back to the scripted persona again after the commercial is over. So I came to see that role playing was actually a expression of, because see, that at the same time that they play this role, what's communicated to you is, this is who I really am. Do you see what I mean? He's not saying, I'm just playing the role of newscaster. He's saying, this is who I really am. So it closes off your awareness that he's actually merely playing a part. And that delay time in his gestures and the artificiality of that kind of role performance or way of being, I came to sort of see that covering the face of the world, that we are all always entrapped in and conditioned to play roles that we were not born with, ways of being artificial that we were not born with, and that the fear embedded in our culture of each other leads us to adapt as a way of keeping the other at a distance, as a way of protecting ourselves behind social facades that at the same that treat the other person as a threat, and that at the same time so protect us, and at the same time leave us feeling isolated, withdrawn into ourselves, and starving for authentic connection and community, which I actually experienced not in a spiritual context for the first time, but in a political movement. In the 60s counterculture, in the social movements of the 1960s, when people came together to struggle against the Vietnam War at that time, what the realization that people had, including me, was not the war is wrong because of this or that reason, rational reason, but rather that there was something insane about the whole process of the war. People were being killed for no reason because we had to keep fighting, because we didn't want to be disgraced, and it was all happening. People were actually dying in the case of the Asian community, by the millions, the Southeast Asian community, because of people being cut off in this way from their authentic humanity. So to me, this revealed, and to many people, this revealed that there was some terrible spiritual void inside the culture and inside human beings that needed to be healed, overcome. There's a record at the time by the Electric Flag, which began with LBJ coming on and saying, somebody's nodding, you may know this. LBJ, for those of you who are younger, was President Lyndon Baines Johnson at the time of the Vietnam War. And he talked in a very broad Texas accent, and he would always say, "My fellow Americans." And the Electric Flag record started with that, and you thought you were listening to a Johnson speech, because it sounded just like him. "My fellow Americans, I'm just here today." And then there's a huge burst of laughter. And the burst of laughter was the recognition by the people making the record, by the Electric Flag. They were trying to show, this is ridiculous. He's playing a part. All the catastrophe surrounding this historical period is being held in place by people not being human because they're afraid to be human, because they're afraid to reveal who they really are, what their real longings are. So that is a spiritual dimension of reality, a spiritual longing that exists underneath the surface of the world. People feel cut off from each other, withdrawn into themselves, passing each other with blank gazes on the street, as I said earlier, hollowed out eyes that often are nowhere near as present as a newborn baby's, for example. When you look in the eyes of a newborn, you're pulled out of yourself immediately. I mean, have you had this experience? You know what I mean? You who have kids or who are around kids. Kids immediately bring joy to you because they relieve us of this detached mode of relating in which we have to be at arm's length from each other, monitoring everything that's going on through a system of roles and through a system of distancing. So this spiritually painful reality is critically involved in politics, in culture, in what's going on. Finding that spiritual meaning in health care for all, in the opportunity to care for each other's health. This is not a cost or a burden. It's a joy to take care of one another's families. It adds meaning to life and richness to life to do it. A whole way of thinking that is associated with the spiritual dimension of existence needs to be incorporated into how we evoke about and talk about social change and social policies. Foreign policy, I'll give one more example. The way to a more secure homeland is to recognize the humanity of others in the world by a global Marshall Plan that will rebuild houses and infrastructure and homes so that people who otherwise are understandably drawn to fanatics and violence when they are living in humiliating conditions and in conditions of poverty suddenly realize that we care about them. We see them as human beings. We recognize their humanity and we want to help them. That's how you draw off people from otherwise being attracted to and reasonably identifying with fanatical, warlike processes. So there's just a couple of examples of how a spiritual activist perspective can fight for progressive change, but bring into it these speaking to these deeper longings, spiritual longings of the soul that are not spoken to always by critiques of the system as a detached thing. Okay, so we're going to try to create here one piece of the parallel universe by having scholarship about this kind of thing and lectures and discussions, showing movies on that screen and then having people talk about the movie afterwards, which the North Bay Film and Art Collective has already started to do in the past year. We're going to have a cafe that we hope to have a cafe, the cafe recognition we're calling it, that actually is a place where you can hang out, but you can also participate in discussions. And we're going to have classes and plays in this space. We already have had several plays in this space. And if we can get a use permit for the back half, we're going to put a much bigger theater back there. But we have to raise money for that. And we have a wonderful building. We don't have any money. So that's the fact of the matter of where we are right now. We're this far along in the process to hold this event.